One thing many people with an inclination towards history like doing is comparing the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to what we're seeing nowadays with the many Western countries of the First World. We tend to find solace in historical analogy because it helps us understand the turbid current times through the lens of familiarity with things that have already happened and played out. But that comfort that we get from drawing parallels could possibly sway our judgment and impact the accuracy of even the most general analogies. The premise of this video is simple. Compare the many societal, economic, and political factors between the current times and the collapsing Roman state. There was a notable change in how the Roman state operated since the death of Marcus Aurelius. The Golden Age was drawing to an end, and the many tensions inside the society were now becoming very apparent. One tendency that's very notable in the failing state is how the government starts reaching for more power as a response to an increasingly violent situation, very often starting the vicious cycle of extreme overreach, culminating in complete collapse. At first, he had a couple of incompetent or crazy emperors, but the pressure from external threats, as well as all the scheming and usurpations, led the Roman heads of state to more and more rely on the military as a force guaranteeing stable rule. This started as a stable means of holding power regardless of the civilian population's approval, which many leaders had a deficit of due to the dreadful economic situation. From the 3rd century onwards, most of what constituted the state was built upon legitimization through force, and by the collapse of the empire it was a warped and inefficient system. Because force was made to be a factor legitimizing rule, the state collapsed into a mess of warring factions. Diocletian alongside Constantine the Great would go on to become the real architects of late antiquity, as through their interventions into politics and the economy, they, while stabilizing the situation, also preserved and prolonged many of the issues and tensions plaguing the empire. Diocletian became the emperor to double down on increasing the power and influence of the state, being the emperor to begin the era of the dominate. The ruler was no longer the first amongst his citizens, a father to the Roman people as with Augustus and the Principate, but now was a master, a dominus, and very often required a proclamation of service and lifelong devotion from his subjects. And so the Roman Empire collapsed, with its leaders having reached for more power than ever, and yet being less effective than ever. One notable thing about the contemporary times that very much resembles the late antiquity is how the government, despite having more means and power to exact control over its citizens, to rule efficiently, despite all of these elements, the state is still awfully weak. Despite having advanced banking systems that allow for instant tax collection, that allow for secure transfer of revenue, despite all of these elements that make administrating easier and ruling more effective, these governments struggle to even perform the most basic duties required of them to keep the country safe, to provide an international presence, to keep organized crime down, and keep native businesses and populations protected from predatory entities from the outside. And so why is such the case with Western governments? First of all, Western governments, the way we traditionally think of them is that at the top of the power structure you have the president, the prime minister, the House of Representatives, and maybe a few wealthy businessmen. But the fact is, these people are just a front for a bigger racket, they're a front for these shareholders who hide behind them as proxies, who utilize the political establishment as a sacrificial effigy for the people to focus all their temperaments and hatred against, while they remain unnoticed. It is a self-stabilizing political system that helps to keep these shareholders, these anonymous shareholders, in charge, because the people, all of their anger, all of their emotion is going to go against these sacrificial governments, these proxies, these frontmen. These shareholders demand profit quickly. They demand it in a timely fashion. They demand it as a normal corporation would. That's why these governments take very destructive paths in the long term. That's why they import foreigners. That's why they don't prioritize their own people, because they have to meet and satisfy the needs of the shareholders, and they want to do it in a classic, timely corporate manner. And so if you ever wonder why certain governments make such stupid decisions that basically end their political careers, why certain people are almost sacrificed through some sort of act of political humiliation, or the absolute worst decision they could have possibly made, they're a sacrificial layer that gets burnt in case of any instability or tension within a society. So if you ever wonder why there are billions, gorillions of dollars being sent to Israel, that's why. You have to know that the parallel of the government reaching for more power than ever and being less effective than ever, reaching for more drastic measures, being more involved in the finances of its citizens than ever, and despite being weaker than any past iteration of its former self, is just one parallel that could be drawn. The Roman societal structure going into the times of the Dominate was drifting away from the highly dynamic social structure of the Middle Roman period. First notable characteristic is how, due to the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine the Great, the many lower classes, both urban and rural, were locked into hereditary trades with no freedom to choose the profession of their liking, regardless if the profession they were assigned was at all possible to subsist on or not. This was done to combat the disenfranchised lower classes dissatisfied with pay and living conditions, abandoning their workplaces and migrating to seek greener pastures elsewhere. The tenant farmers, that being farmers that had to pay rent for the land they worked, were now bound to that land by law, and in case they were to flee the estates they worked for, were to be deemed fugitives and return to their original landowners they were ascribed to, even after decades of being on the run. This fact shows how people that were nominally free and had Roman citizenship were virtually treated as slaves. On that note, it's interesting to see that parallel to political ability being stripped away from it, the citizens, the slave population was declining. This was mainly because there weren't as many prisoners of war being brought in as back in the heyday of Roman expansion, but also it became custom to promise slave liberation after 30 to 40 years of service. This ended up in liberated slaves not really benefiting much from the newly achieved freedoms, as they most likely still had to work the same large estates, now as a tenant farmer due to the monopoly the large landowners possessed on the agrarian economy. Another staple of the Roman collapse was the disappearing middle class, the Ordo Decurionum or the Curiales. They were in essence local councilmen in the many small towns of the empire, often being small landowners, wealthy craftsmen or traders, constituting what could be called a politically and economically aspiring middle class. Unfortunately, this group was one of the most economically overburdened groups in the whole empire, as not only were the towns maintained and run from their pocket, but they still had to pay tax to the governments regardless. You see, during the Roman times, governments didn't really subsidize small towns, and everything from regular upkeep to the judiciary system was paid for mainly by said councilmen. And this position was made hereditary as well due to people abandoning them because of the burden it placed on an individual. And in the last decades of the Western Roman Empire, it was common to, as a result of political bickering, be assigned as councilmen as revenge from the winning side. It was seen as a form of punishment to have to endure the political and economic strain of being a member of the middle classes. Who can find words to describe the enormity of our present situation, now when the Roman Commonwealth, already extinct, or at least drawing its last breath in that one corner where it still seems to retain some life, is dying, strangled by the cords of taxation as if by the hands of brigands? Still a great number of wealthy men are found, the burden of whose taxes is borne by the poor. That is, very many rich men are found whose taxes are murdering the poor. Very many, I said. I'm afraid I might more truly say all, for so few, if any, are free from this evil, that we may find practically all of the rich in this category, to which I have just assigned many of them. This excerpt from Salvianus tells us a great deal about how the middle and lower classes were leveled into a more homogeneous bubble of poverty as a result of the government's decision-making, all while the upper classes still not only managed to weather the collapse, but also often benefited from it, as not only was labor more abundant with the new barbarian arrivals, but the hopeless small farmer, along with his land, would be bought up by the wealthy landowner and bound in feudal dependency. The cursus honorum, the act of climbing the social ladder, was pretty much dead in civilian life by the collapse of the Western state, and so previously diverse groups would fall victim to the times they had to endure, but also the outright desperation of the Roman state, cannibalizing its own population for mere subsistence, only to eventually collapse in the end. The contemporary world seems to be at least partially following in Rome's footsteps when it comes to the tendencies that are plaguing society. In this case, the disappearing middle class and the increasing gap between the wealth owned by the financial elites and what is owned by the rest. So one thing that has to be noted is the conflict of interest. First of all, there's a big difference in what benefits the financial elites and the rest of the society, in this case, the diminishing middle class. First of all, controlled inflation benefits the financial elites. The closer you are to when the money is released, the more of a benefit you take before that money hits the market and devalues the rest of it. So if a government prints money and suddenly the biggest corporations, the biggest financial funds put that money in their own stock, because they are so close to that money, because they were coordinating with the government when it came to the release of that money, they don't take the full brunt of that money getting devalued from inflation. And so they benefited from it, while when that money gets in the hands of the middle and lower classes, it's already devalued by a great deal. Case in point, last quarter of 2020, the UK government decides to print way more money. That money is instantly dumped by the biggest corporations into their own stocks before it gets devalued. And this, despite increasing inflation, despite worsening the situation for a lower class and middle class people, it benefited greatly the financial elites and was shown in unprecedented GDP growth in the midst of one of the biggest recessions in recent years. Another aspect is how outsourcing work benefits financial elites, but is a problem to middle and lower classes. First of all, job opportunities. Second of all, the middle classes, the small business owners, they cannot afford to outsource work. They have to usually employ people that are local, while these companies can go to the third world and hire 1 million Indians to do that job for them. I think this growing dissonance is best shown by the GDP index. It's a metric by which we measure economic growth, but since it was first implemented, the economic dissonance, the stratification between the financial elites and the lower classes has become so great. The share of the lower classes in wealth in general has become so low that it no longer represents the actual economic growth of an entire society, but rather is just a census by which we measure the growth of strictly the people that have the most market share, that own most wealth. And not to mention that GDP, because of this, even more so now, doesn't correlate and doesn't answer the questions of living conditions, of work opportunities, of living costs. And So there's a great dissonance between the interests of the financial elites and their growth and the growth of the rest of the society. This GDP discrepancy outlines a very similar issue that has happened in late Rome, where success of the agricultural aristocracy was not linked with the success of the lower classes that became a homogeneous bubble of poverty that became forced more and more into these proto-feudal dependencies. And so I think it wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that there are parallels between what we're seeing now and ancient Rome, with the middle and lower classes being overburdened by the economic policies that benefit the extremely wealthy, first of all, and second of all, the stratification, the destruction of the middle class, and the homogenizing of the lower class as a single bubble of poverty. It definitely strikes a resemblance. It's interesting to see how the Roman senatorial elites responded to this whole crisis going into the collapse of the Western Empire, as they, throughout the Republican and Principate periods in Roman history, were arguably the most influential group in the entire society. The senators also grew in number during the Dominate period as a result of a strategy implemented by Constantine the Great to make it seem like they are still relevant, and also just staffing the Senate with his own supporters. Increasingly more senators would move out of Rome into the countryside to look over their own land and become more of a landowning class, the point where in the 4th century legislation was passed that required senators to at least attend the most important services and functions in the Eternal City. As the Roman state deteriorated, what used to be the senatorial class was becoming a very influential and politically relevant class of wealthy landowners, which benefited greatly from the empire fragmenting and central power being dissolved. They had ample opportunity to set up agrarian monopolies through buying up land alongside the bankrupt individual farmers that worked them. As the economy of the Western Roman Empire was slowly collapsing, the landowners were becoming more and more self-sufficient, being able to manufacture their own tools, construct their own buildings, and raise their own livestock. This meant that in a period during and after the Roman collapse, they have managed to create their own monopolies on almost every aspect of agrarian life, further reducing the economic opportunities of the lower classes and fitting very nicely into the paradigm of fragmented and warring barbarian states. The wealthy landowning class, due to the empire slowly collapsing alongside its institutions, could and often had to field their own armies and police forces to not only help and protect their land in such turbulent times, but also to become regional powers themselves, being able to exact an actual military presence. So not only did they possess a virtual monopoly on agrarian life, but also managed to become actual political entities themselves. This fragmentation and decentralization of power led slowly to reinforce the early medieval feudal structures with small duchies, dukedoms, and kingdoms, replacing the sprawling, interconnected, and homogeneous trade and military structures of late Rome. The historical rule that wealth is the only insulation from societal and economic downturn stands true, as the biggest landowners, mostly from the senatorial class, were able to buy up land for dirt cheap alongside its workforce and prosper, while the previously diverse middle and lower classes ended up taking the brunt of the collapse. There's one historical rule, and it's that technology most benefits the extremely wealthy. Not only is it expensive to field in practice and develop, but also to own. I talked about the feudal dependencies of late antiquity, with the large estate owners monopolizing every aspect of agrarian life through the empire fragmenting and the rural aristocracy no longer needing the service of protection from the army because they could field their own police forces. Not only that the agrarian nobility no longer need the service of protection from the state, but also have replaced the plentiful and individual and independent traders of the Roman Principate with their own private trade fleets, which in effect have completely monopolized trade in agrarian societies. An interesting parallel is how developments in computer science, how developments in software engineering have allowed the extremely wealthy to completely monopolize aspects that are so crucial to everyday functioning of not only the state itself, but most humans, where you have no choice but to use a service to function as a human in a society. You have to use Microsoft Teams to do work. You have to use online banking to pay your taxes. The internet has allowed for a lot of independent finance, for a lot of independent growth, for many small business owners to expand even more. And while that's true, there is a benefit for the lower classes. By interfacing with these services, you are ensnared in a system of dependency because you base your entire business, you base your livelihood on a private monopolized service, on something that could be pulled right from under your feet in an instant. I think it's a pretty good parallel with how dominated agrarian life was becoming by private estate owners, how the entire economy and military presence was constituted by the single agrarian monopoly of what was left of the very fragmented Roman Empire. We definitely see a similar tendency with current large capital increasing in size and monopolizing even most rudimentary services that a government or an individual might need to function. What is happening is the wide masses of the Western world are being trapped in a system of dependency on these services. During the late antiquity, not only was the influx of barbarians into the empire strong on its own, but it also was often encouraged in both civilian settlement and military cooperation between the Western Roman state and the many foreign tribes. The Western Roman society was so fragmented with so many usurpers and sides to the conflict that it wasn't really a case that barbarians fought against the Romans like intuitively we tend to think, but rather the many subjects of the conflict, often Romans, would utilize barbarian units and mercenaries to further their own goals. The military collapse of the empire came about as a result of struggles that internalized many barbarian troops within what constituted the Roman state. This resulted with barbarians in late antiquity being heavily involved in doing the Romans' bidding. Not only was the military extremely saturated with barbarians, but so was the emperor's court alongside his advisors and closest military leaders. And this, unlike what many claim, wasn't the case of the native Romans growing soft and useless in the field, but rather that barbarians were very useful politically as they constituted an extremely numerous and capable force. Their usefulness came about as many unpopular leaders with the Romans could utilize barbarians to prop themselves up politically. Most of the important fighting also happened in areas with numerous local barbarian populations, as well as their tribal divisions were easy to utilize to more efficiently rule them. The state also found itself catering towards the fresh barbarian settlers. Legislation passed in 398 mandated that lands conquered by the many barbarian tribal formations were to have 1/3 of its household ceded to the new barbarian arrivals. The civilian settlement of the barbarians came about also as a natural course of the many regions of the empire being depopulated due to political turmoil, as well as many barbarian federati troops bringing their families with them after military campaigns. It's interesting to note how barbarian arrival in what remained of the empire wasn't seen as a unanimously negative tendency, as however sparse sources from this period speak of a lack of a widespread conflict between the local populations and the immigrating tribes. This tendency would be generally unfortunate for the native Roman population, as not only were they seen as politically irrelevant, but also the local workforces would be oversaturated with fresh arrivals that often had differing or lower expectations as to the living and working conditions, and so the lower classes were not able to become homogeneous enough to share common interest. The native population being put at a disadvantage due to unfortunate circumstances and political malice becoming common practice is just another classic trope of a collapsing society and a historical parallel between the current state of affairs and what happened in Rome. Utilizing immigrants is one of the hallmarks of the 21st century. It's probably one of the most widely used political and economic strategies that every Western nation of the first world has seen in some form in the last 20 years. It's of great utility on two different levels. First of all, there is the lower governmental level. Increased immigration can create an electorate out of thin air. It can bring people in from completely different cultural and ethnic backgrounds that have different goals, different standards regarding governmental rule, and different cultural norms that necessitate a differently run state. And the state, the government, certain parties can pander and rely on the newly brought in immigrants to get votes and to stay in power. Also, dropping the requirements for voting in elections. You no longer need to have an ID, so very often people without citizenship can vote. The other aspect of political utility ties into that cultural and ethnic difference that you get from immigrants antagonizing the immigrants against the native populations. So when an immigrant of a different cultural and ethnic background enters a Western state, not only is his pride going to be fueled by many political initiatives, but he's also going to be on a crusade to root out native culture that he's seeing all around him, that he believes to be an oppressive system or a system that's different to his and inferior to his. And on the second level, on the economic level, it's very easy to see these immigrants, they're uncivilized, they don't hold their own governments, their own societies, to even the sliver of a standard that Western countries and Western natives do. They are a workforce that are willing to work for less, that are more easily replaceable because they come from overpopulated countries. They don't require as good of working conditions, and also are simply through cultural and ethnic division less likely to unionize and form a common narrative, a common goal with the native white working class. This style of governance is a definition of divide and conquer, and it's a very effective way of keeping stability and of keeping in charge in Western states. By keeping the Western native population on their back foot with no way of ever resolving the problem, only further increasing the tensions and animosity between the two groups. This has to be said. Such instrumental use of immigrants has not been seen in Rome. In Rome, what we've seen is depopulated frontiers buckle under the weight of barbarian people kind of naturally pushing up against the borders of the empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was just a matter of time before they breached the borders and entered the already depopulated borderlands and frontiers of the Roman Empire. Compare this to the current times where these migrants are being basically let in and shipped into the country. The immigration routes are being planned out, and the governments very often scoop the immigrants up themselves in boats and allow them into the country. This parallel isn't as easy as the other ones, and I wouldn't say is much of a parallel. The coordinated malice of Western governments and the natural course of action with Roman Empire, I think there's a big difference, and we're starting to see a few cracks in the whole comparison, and we're going to be seeing way more of them from this point onwards. Ideology in a society is interesting as it encompasses the culture, religion, and morality that hold the whole structure together. A symptomatic look at the changing ideological landscape of the Western Roman Empire can already by itself tell us a great deal about the turmoil taking place in late antiquity. The main line of discourse was happening alongside the old pagan system clashing with Christianity on almost all levels of the societal structure. First of all, the mos maiorum, the unwritten code of conduct that was associated with prosperity of the Roman people by both upper and lower classes, would slowly fade into non-existence during the time of the late Dominate. This would mark the slow cultural and societal dissolution of the traditional and deeply entrenched in Roman custom perception of what a Roman citizen should aspire to be. The worsening political and economic conditions leading to an increasingly insufficient living standard buried the myth of supremacy of the Roman ways in the eyes of the common people. In many provinces of the West, the Roman government in its last century of existence was despised by the locals as a result of its institutions failing. Many were such cases where locally stationed troops would pillage Roman citizens for food as well as for any other spoils of war as a system implemented by heads of military to keep the armies from revolting and under their control. It was most common practice of the ruling class to utilize the army, often at a cost to the local Roman population, to realize their own political ambitions. The many hundreds of usurpations that have taken place in the last century of Rome's existence have cemented the provincial population's resentment of what they perceived as the Roman state. Of course, military overreach was only one of the many reasons, alongside extreme taxation and intrusive judiciary and economic regulation, for the common man to despise the Western state. It should be no surprise that despite the many barbarian invasions into the empire, most of them also being destructive towards the lower classes, barbarian rule itself wasn't as negatively seen by the local populations and didn't harbor as much resistance as we would expect. The Mos Maiorum, while being a conflicting ideal with Christianity, wasn't even a religion on its own, but rather a system implementing and incentivizing many traditional Roman religious practices. It would slowly get replaced by Christianity through both ideological conflict and slow dissolution. Christianity would go on to be the defining factor in creating a new Roman identity during its collapse, often being the civilizing force that would bring Roman ideals to newly settled barbarian tribes. Christianity in the 4th and 5th century was a deeply Romanized faith, including many philosophical concepts, ways of administration, and lawmaking that blossomed under the new faith. So from what we've discerned, there are a few similarities between ancient Rome and the contemporary times. First of all, the absolutely useless yet extremely intrusive and overreaching states. Second of all, the instrumental utilization of foreigners, sometimes from completely different societal, religious, and ethnic backgrounds, very often conflicting with the native populations. The economic policies that only seem to benefit the extremely wealthy and hamper the growth of the lower and middle classes. The state being just a vessel for realizing private interest. So far, all of these things check out, but there's one discrepancy that is the point of this whole video that I want to talk about. So, as I've said, ideology was important in late Roman society. On the grounds of ideology, the conservative native Roman senatorial elites clashed with the middle and lower classes, looking for a new answer for a decrepit old system that, in their eyes, has betrayed them. The big discrepancy lies in the fact that during the late antiquity, the higher classes were notoriously conservative, notoriously pagan, notoriously trying to embody what it meant to be Roman, the old Roman virtue, while the lower classes were notoriously dynamic ideologically, being absolutely dissatisfied with the Mos Maiorum, with the old Roman ways, because of their worsening living conditions, where they were more dissatisfied than ever and sought different answers, sought Oriental and mystic religions, sought Christianity, and were thrashing against the confines of ideology, trying to come up with an answer for a new situation that they found themselves in. But nowadays, in a society that is seemingly following the same tendencies as I've outlined, we're seeing a reversal of these roles, with a stagnant, indifferent, or even outright conservative lower class, and a very ideologically active, overreaching financial elite that is trying to reform people to their own liking when it comes to ideology that is often anti-traditional, that is very revolutionary in terms of culture, in terms of religion, that stands in opposition to what traditionally built the Western rise to power: religion, nationalism, any feeling of pride, any feeling of preference of people closest to you, most related to you, the preference for your own kinsmen, or on the other hand, trying to shove faux right-wing narratives that are just mere distractions, regardless of what beliefs are exhibited by these political elites. One thing cannot be denied: the weight of political, economic, and societal discourse is even more so than at any time in history placed upon ideology. This issue, this discrepancy, is big enough, in my opinion, to completely discredit the analogy that I was trying to craft this whole video. This discrepancy, to me, is one primary reason why I don't believe that we are seeing the exact same tendencies mirrored nowadays that we saw with ancient Rome. It's nothing new that conflict erupts on ideological basis, on or under the guise of ideology. The many conflicts between the pagans and the Christians, the many conflicts within the early church itself. It's nothing new to do battle on the ground of ideology. Why is this big a discrepancy between the Roman times and now taking place? The answer why such is the case is awfully simple. It's technology. It's not human nature. It's not some new evolution of how we behave. It's the simple fact of the tools that we possess have changed. Technology, thanks to the advent of internet, electricity, many advanced softwares, many advanced devices allow us to communicate way more efficiently, to communicate in every place of the world, allow us to communicate almost instantly. What that technology has done, what the internet has done, what communication software have done, is they have allowed communication, the most elementary factor in human discourse, to become monetized. The act of exchanging information, the act of communicating, something so elementary to human existence that has such a wide field of utility, of importance to us, it cannot be understated. So ideology to a human living in a society is innate to communication. If you communicate, you express ideology, that your demeanor, the way you look, the way you dress, the most subtle cues in your behavior, and of course the ideas, the contents of your words that you express, all of that can be reduced to ideological discourse. Money is a compacted form of labor, and for that labor to be produced even in times when you're not aware of it, even in times when you're spending your leisure time consuming entertainment, when you're consuming media in your free time, you're still producing labor. Not only that, but these tools, these technologies that have been developed, these softwares are very often even required for you to even function in society. You have to use communication software to work. You have to use it to pay your taxes. You have to use it to interact with the people you work with and the people you work for. The same way agriculture was seen as the dominant, most important, most elementary economic sector in late Rome or in ancient Rome in general. That same way communications are the most important subject of the current economy nowadays. When you look at what software you use for everyday life, for even the most basic amenities, for even the most basic functions that a citizen has to perform, paying taxes, going to work, keeping a schedule, making appointments, all of these aspects you have to partake in, regardless if you want to or not. You don't have any other alternatives, and you're left to participate in the monopoly. Never ever in human history have there been such monopolies on such a basic amenity in human life, like the most basic act of exchanging information. And so to circle back, ideology is innate to communication. If communication is so important, that means ideology is extremely important. That means that ideology is the key to having any sort of power, to having any sort of possible influence and making profits on this very lucrative, unseen before market. Notice how easy it is to create markets out of thin air, to drum up demand through scaring people ideologically. For example, the whole ecological movement is a testament to how easily you can scare a population into creating a market, how you can sell subpar, useless, inefficient solutions as answers to problems that never really existed. It becomes apparent how important ideological conviction becomes when you realize how much of the economy, how much demand, how much money there is in simple convictions that something is going to happen. If someone is convinced something is going to happen, they're going to put money into it. And how do you convince people through communicating? What is innate to communication? Ideology. You can scare people ideologically into buying things. Notice how much of the economy, especially the stock market, is built on single ply, thin, absolutely see-through promises that something is going to succeed in the future. How much conviction, which is a deeply ideological concept, is important in driving economy, in driving demand, and how profitable it is. It's easy to see why these monopolists, these shareholders of sorts, have so much skin in the ideological game, because it means to have control over communications, to have control over ideology. It means to have control over the world, to have real influence. I think the reason why Western native lower classes, the working classes, are pretty immune to these ideologies, regardless if they're right-wing facades or left-wing destructionist ideas. How many of these ideologies are so garish and nonsensical and a clear attempt at subversion that even subconsciously it creates a conflict within the mind of the lower classes. The difference between what the individual sees with his own eyes, experiences with his own skin, and what is presented as a solution is such a garish dissonance. It's such an inconsolable difference. Even if they're not ideologically or aesthetically motivated, they still tend to stick to forms that in some way resemble tradition. And that explains why that ideology, instead of coming from the bottom of the society, instead of coming from the grassroots of the people, is seeping down from the top, seemingly trying to make contact with everyday people, trying to ensnare the working native men of the West, is now a meticulously calculated tool meant to, with the highest degree of efficiency, impose certain behaviors on the wide masses to achieve certain goals. Everything you're seeing when it comes to ideology, everything when you're told that your race is inferior, that your religion doesn't exist, that your country doesn't matter and its borders are just a construct, that you ought to be replaced by more suitable third worlders. And it all boils down to the simple fact that what we're seeing now is malice and not a mirror into the souls and minds of the people. We're seeing a heavily coordinated, meticulously planned operation of social engineering. This whole discrepancy was just to show that we are living in different times than late Rome, that comparing these times is good, but you cannot fall for the trap of historical analogy, because it's very easy to say that just because something it mostly resembles something, that it is something. It's a surface level resemblance. And when you dig deep, you realize that the paradigm has shifted, that the analogy is in this case invalidated.